Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Notorious Life of Ned Buntline, a tale of murder, betrayal, and the creation of Buffalo Bill, by Julia Bricklin. Narrated by Chris Abernathy. Introduction. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, on May 11, 1849, 4 men rushed into the main entrance of the imposing brick hospital on a bluff directly above the East River. Their stretcher held William Harmer, who had immigrated to New York City from New Brunswick the year before. He worked as a butcher on 3rd Avenue and 8th Street. Harmer screamed in agony and clutched his abdomen. The men who brought him in tried to hold him flat down and at the same time tried to hold kerchiefs over their mouths and noses, afraid of the cholera germs that had already killed 3,000 New Yorkers that year. There was no ether contraption available because so many wounded had been pouring in since 10 o'clock the night before, but a nurse managed to place a filthy chloroform rag over his mouth and provide some relief. A doctor worked feverishly to remove the musket ball, but could not do so without further damage to Harmer's intestines. He cut his losses, hastily sewed the patient up, and moved on to the next. Harmer lingered until 4 o'clock that afternoon, when he mercifully died. He was 15 years old. The teen was a victim of New York City's bloodiest riot. The day before, at 6:30 o'clock in the evening, people began to assemble around the theater at Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan. Within half an hour, crowds wended their way to it from other parts of the city. By 7:30 p.m., several hundred people had gathered in the street in front of the brick and stone structure with imperious colonnades. Horses and carriages could no longer get through from Astor Place or East 8th Street, the roads on either side of the venue. The evening's performance of Macbeth was already sold out, but still the crowd grew bigger. By 7:45, there were so many people packed around the Astor Opera House that on adjacent Broadway, dozens stood precariously at the top of an earthen mound dug for a sewer line. Inside the hall, patrons jostled and bumped and cursed to get to their seats. Policemen pulled out the rowdiest hooters and hecklers and locked them in rooms beneath the box seats. A hush fell over the audience when the play officially opened at 8. The theater remained silent during the first 2 scenes featuring actor C.W. Clarke as Macduff. But when the 3rd scene opened and British actor Charles Macready appeared on stage, a group of men shouted, groaned, and hissed. Some cried, "Out with him! Out with him!" Police and other patrons subdued the worst offenders. The play went on, and while there was a constant low hum of excitement, all of the performers could be heard clearly. Some minutes later, the smell of smoke began to permeate the gallery. The 4 prisoners in the temporary prison underneath the boxes had funneled wood shavings and pieces onto gas lights and started a fire. Policemen opened the doors and put the men in irons, but not before oily smoke spread throughout the hall. Patrons put handkerchiefs over their faces and fanned themselves, but most planned to keep watching the program, until some viewers began hurling chairs upon the stage, and all heard the sound of breaking glass. Macready and the other actors scurried off the stage and into the safety of their carriages, waiting out back. Volley after volley of large paving stones smashed through the windows on all sides of the theater, and the showgoers erupted into a mass of confusion. Their screams of panic and pain as some fell under the fleeing limbs of others were juxtaposed against those of one man outside yelling, "Stone the building!" The windows, sans glass, held for a few minutes, but the mob outside succeeded in splintering open the frames and tossing in even more stone and bottle projectiles. Cooler heads inside the Astor building managed to corral many of the women away from the windows and flying shards of glass, but panic ensued again minutes later when a rumor began circulating that there was a bomb inside the building and that a fire had been set to it on the outside. "Where is the military? Where is the mayor?" wailed patrons. A few men tapped out the remnants of glass in one frame, hoisted the theater's fire hose outside of it, and sprayed the mob in an effort to get it to disperse. But this just inflamed the angry masses even more, and they gathered more flagstones to hurl against the structure. A dozen or so men from the mob took turns battering the main entrance, and just as they succeeded, an equal dozen or so policemen burst out of a side door and began pulling the offenders all the way in, clubbing them as they did so. Things were direr outside the venue. At about 9:15, a company of mounted troops with drawn swords riding two abreast on white horses approached the swirling cabal. These were followed by 2 divisions of National Guard infantry, marching with fixed bayonets raised high. As the procession reached the corner of the Bowery and turned down 8th Street, rioters began showering the animals and their riders with rocks, and some of the horses tossed off their riders. Those who maintained their seats turned around and galloped back to a safe distance. The infantry quickly filled their vacated spots on the street and marched resolutely toward the Opera House. The 7th Regiment was a very disciplined group, and it began to clear a path between Broadway and the Bowery. It seemed that the crowd might finally disperse when shots rang out. One captain took a bullet to the leg, while another took one to the cheek. After dozens of men fell hurt out of the ranks, their colonel finally ordered them to fire warning shots above the crowd. When a minute or two passed and no rioters appeared hurt, the mob thought wrongly that the infantry was using blank cartridges. Encouraged, the violent crowd rushed the troops, each caught up in the shared consciousness that he could crush the peacemakers, without collectively questioning why. At this point, the militia fired directly upon it, and even as rioters fell back wounded or killed, the mass of people still pushed forward. In the dark, flashes of gunfire highlighted men and boys scrambling every which way, tumbling over each other and getting sucked under the roiling stew of humanity. A general drew his men up and ordered them to turn their fire toward the intersection of the Bowery and 4th Avenue, where some 1,000 or so rioters congregated. At last, the murderous gang of thousands started to break up and retreat. When the smoke cleared, hundreds of people lay on the streets, dead, dying, or maimed. Most were injured by thrown rocks or other debris, or had been trampled. Scores were wounded by the pocket pistols of the rioters, or the guns fired by the National Guard. Young William Harmer, and at least 22 others, were killed by the infantry's fire. Many of the killed and wounded were merely passers-by or spectators who had taken no part in the riot. Judge Charles P. Daly, who would preside over the eventual case against the primary perpetrators of the violence, recounted some of the human carnage. A woman walking with her husband on Broadway was shot dead. A man was killed instantly by a musket ball while stepping from a Harlem Railroad car. An eminent merchant was wounded in the neck by a ball while standing in the Bowery, and another person was severely wounded by a shot in St. Mark's Place, 2 blocks from the scene of the riot. A Mr. Gedney was shot dead while looking at the riot from the corner of Astor and Lafayette places, and his own brother was a member of the platoon that had fired the volley. Citizens quickly dubbed the madness of this evening the Astor Place riot. It was the bloodiest event to occur in New York City history at that time. The instigator of it all was Edward Zane Carroll Judson. At Judson's trial that September of 1849, his brother-in-law Frank Bennett recounted how he had been duped into accompanying Judson that evening. Judson picked him up from work in his carriage, and on the route home he said that the editors of the Courier and Inquirer, for whom he worked, wanted him to head a riot that evening. Astonished, Bennett asked him why anyone would demand such a thing of their employee. "The authorities have ordered out the troops," Judson said, "and I consider it an insult to the American people." Bennett still did not quite understand why the mayor would order troops for something that had not happened yet, but he knew Judson had visited with American-born actor Edwin Forrest the day before, and that night his brother-in-law's gray eyes flashed with anger as he bellowed about the injustice of Macready, a Brit, taking on the Shakespearean role that should have gone to Forrest. The young Bennett felt compelled to watch over his sister's husband. His mother knew Judson was up to something and bade her 23-year-old son to follow him closely. Anna Bennett, Judson's wife, got on her knees and begged him not to go out, but he ignored her and instead walked upstairs and put on Frank's white sack coat and Tom Hyer cap, which covered most of his flaming red hair. He also put 2 pistols in the coat pocket and a dagger in a pants pocket. At dusk, the pair took a carriage from the Bennett home on Abingdon Square and clip-clopped down 12th Street. "Let's go down to the Opera House," Judson said to Frank. "I hear there's going to be a sport there." First, though, he insisted on stopping at a pub at the junction of 12th Street and Broadway. There, he insisted Frank take one of his pistols. He explained that some of his enemies, gamblers, would likely be there, and he needed his brother-in-law to watch out for any trouble. After Judson downed several shots of whiskey, he and Frank headed down 4th Avenue to 8th Street and Lafayette. Judson drove around the Opera House once, appraising it. Finally, the two disembarked and walked toward the small crowd. "Are there any Americans here?" Judson roared. "The ground is your own, and you have a right to it, and I will assist you in defending your right." The response was tepid, Bennett recounted later, so Judson complained to the group that it needed to work in concert to get anything done. "Couldn't you get up the cry of fire?" Judson bellowed. "Gather some shavings, boys!" People in the crowd began to recognize Judson. He was, they realized, Ned Buntline, the famous author, adventurer, and provocateur. Only 26 years old, the man was already famous throughout the eastern seaboard. He had been editor of the Western Literary Review and had written smashing adventures for Knickerbocker magazine. He had founded his own paper, Ned Buntline's Magazine, and was the author of Mysteries and Miseries of New York, the sensational volume about gamblers, prostitutes, child snatchers, thieves, and murderers who prowled the underbelly of their city. In Mysteries and Miseries and his other dime novels, there were murders, drunken brawls, suicide attempts, blackmail, ravished virgins, adulterous wives and husbands, golden-hearted prostitutes, abortions, marauding scions, daring escapes, Bowery folk heroes, and everything else you can think of in a page-turning guilty pleasure. Judson was a celebrity in part because his written works were so popular, but also because his reported life exploits were no less exciting and notorious. He left his father's home in Philadelphia at age 15 and joined the Navy. He received a midshipman's commission after purportedly saving 17 men from drowning in a boat crash in the Staten Island harbor. After he had served a couple of years on vessels in the ports of Philadelphia, Bricklin, and Boston, Judson joined the U.S. man-of-war Levant and sailed for the Caribbean. After a short time patrolling against French blockades of Veracruz, Mexico, the Navy sent him to Pensacola, Florida, where the stocky teen was assigned to a cutter that patrolled southern Florida, battling Seminoles who tried to tear down U.S. military installations there. He created the pen name Ned Buntline. A buntline is one of the ropes attached to the foot of a square sail, and related his swashbuckling experiences in such stories as A Chase in the Everglades. Judson detached from the Navy in 1845. The writer recounted his next adventure in his Knickerbocker magazine. He traveled to Eddyville, Kentucky, where in November 1845 he supposedly captured 2 murderers who were hiding in some woods, an accomplishment that won him $600. Restless, Judson moved on to Nashville, where he hoped to make some money as a freelance writer and perhaps find investors for a new magazine. On March 14, 1846, he shot and killed Robert Porterfield, husband of a teen with whom he allegedly had been having criminal intercourse. A mob tried to lynch Judson for what he had done, but the rope broke, and he managed to escape the city. He took the first steamer available to Pittsburgh, where his father lived, and when his name no longer appeared in the newspapers for the Nashville incident, he moved to New York City. Here he wrote The Maid of Monterey, A Tale of the Mexican War, Virgin of the Sun, The Red Revenger, and dozens of other novels that turned him into a household name and a wealthy man. At the time of the Astor Place riot, Judson was married to Annie Abigail Bennett, a beautiful woman from a very respectable mercantile family in Lower Manhattan. Annie became pregnant, and the pair took an apartment in her family's large home on Abingdon Square. Despite Annie's and her family's best efforts, Judson's dark side surpassed his amiable one, and his true nature soon became public knowledge. He drank to excess for days at a time, and then spent an equal number of days completely sober, unable to stop violently chastising any family or friends who dared have so much as a brandy after dinner. On April 9, 1849, Judson's wife suffered the ultimate humiliation when a well-known madam named Kate Hastings accosted her husband in the middle of Broadway. "You dirty, mean, sneaking, paltry son of a bitch! How dare you publish me in your paper?" Hastings hollered, then pulled out a horsewhip and thrashed him until he needed medical attention for his wounds. Though Hastings had no compunction whatsoever about running a house of prostitution, she took exception to Buntline's description of her as the infamous cast-off mistress of a deceased gambler known as Gallows Kate Hastings, the keeper of a low house of prostitution on Leonard Street. Judson took Hastings to court for the assault and won, but this only served to publicize the fact that he was a frequent visitor to Hastings' house of prostitution. The judge was forced to find in the writer's favor based on point of law, but he was so outraged at Judson's behavior that he fined Hastings a mere 6 cents. Between this trial in April 1849 and the one in September of that same year that found the writer guilty of instigating the bloodiest riot known in recent memory, Annie Bennett had had enough. She divorced Judson in October 1849, a few weeks after Judson was sent to prison at Blackwell's Island. For most souls, being imprisoned in Blackwell's Island for a year would be enough motivation to pursue a more bucolic lifestyle. But prison just seemed to give Edward Judson time to come up with more ideas for books and escapades. On the day of his release, rowdy friends met him with a band playing Hail to the Chief. He spent the next 20 years crisscrossing the United States as the human embodiment of contradictions. He delivered fiery temperance lectures and drank ambitiously. He proclaimed the virtues of public peace, but in addition to causing the Astor Place riot, he stirred up another one in St. Louis, which killed at least 3 men. He despaired of social injustice, but only reluctantly spoke or wrote against slavery. He admired strong and independent women, but held suffragists in nearly satiric contempt. He professed a sanctimonious devotion to the institutions of chastity and marriage, but married at least 9 women, sometimes 2, even 3 at a time. He was apparently irreligious, but treated the faithful, including Indians and their pagan beliefs, with respect, and once considered embracing spiritualism. He fashioned an isolated existence in the Adirondack Mountains, churning out some 100 novels in just a couple of years, and then abandoned this retreat for crowded barracks as a Civil War private. In turn, his real and imagined experiences in the war inspired dozens more bestsellers about rebel privateers, cavalry scouts, villains, female Union spies, and battles with Native Americans on the more western fringes of the rebellion. 20 years after the Astor Place riot, Judson discovered William Cody by accident while briefly exploring these more western regions in person. In the late summer of 1869, the populist writer headed to Fort McPherson, Nebraska, on his way back from a temperance tour in California. He was looking for heroes of a conflict known as the Battle of Summit Springs. On July 11th, the U.S. Army's 5th Cavalry had attacked a village of Cheyenne dog soldiers. The Cheyennes had 2 white captives, and during the fight, one of them was killed by one of the Cheyennes. Major Frank J. North of the U.S. Army's white soldiers and his band of Pawnee scouts tricked and then killed Tall Bull, leader of the Cheyennes. What better hero for Judson to write about? Major North had no interest in becoming Judson's hero. In fact, he did not care for writers in general. "If you want a man to fill that bill," he told Judson, "he's over there under the wagon." The writer, so the story goes, stumbled over where recuperating soldiers were trying to sleep in the fly-infested heat. He poked beneath a wagon, perhaps looking for shade, and found a young giant with sleepy eyes and straw in his long hair. William Frederick Cody was 23 years old and already well known in frontier circles when he and Judson met. Too young to enlist in the formal army when the Civil War broke out, Cody rode for the Kansas Redlegs, an anti-slavery militia. He enlisted with the 7th Kansas Cavalry in 1864. After the war ended, he married and then worked as an Army scout and dispatch carrier in Fort Ellsworth, Kansas. In 1867, Cody got work hunting buffalo to feed the construction crews of the Kansas Pacific Railroad. According to Cody, he killed 4,280 head of buffalo within 17 months. Whatever the actual number, it was this trade and his wholesale slaughter within it that earned him the nickname Buffalo Bill. In 1868, Cody returned to his work for the Army, where General Philip Sheridan made him chief scout for the 5th Cavalry. He took part in 16 battles, including the Cheyenne defeat at Summit Springs. Cody even took credit for killing Tall Bull, though evidence suggests otherwise. Whatever the case, Cody knew all of the details of the fight at Summit Springs and all of its participants. Edward Judson found the scout to be engaging, talkative, and believable. Most importantly, he found Cody to be the perfect embodiment of righteousness, adventure, and gallantry. With delight, he accepted Cody's invitation to ride with him to scout for Indians, something Judson claimed he had done as a teenager when fighting the Seminoles in Florida. Also, Judson claimed he had used similar techniques during the recent Civil War to ferret Confederates from their nests in the woods of Virginia. Judson spent several days, weeks perhaps, on the Platte with Cody, but they encountered no hostile Indians. His vacation over, the writer returned to New York with his head full of stories. On December 7, 1869, Judson, as Ned Buntline, published his first story about Cody in Street and Smith's New York Weekly. It was entitled Buffalo Bill, the King of the Bordermen, and it was printed in installments between the last few weeks of 1869 and March 1870. It featured the exploits of hero Buffalo Bill and his erstwhile sidekick Wild Bill Hickok, and villains like Jake McCandless, a pro-slavery Missouri bushwhacker. Naturally, Cody and Hickok smote all villains by the end of the story, and Buntline left his readers breathless for the next novel. In 1872, Judson convinced Cody to travel east and star in a play he had written featuring him, called Scouts of the Prairie. The show was outrageously popular along the eastern seaboard and introduced the world to the showman Buffalo Bill, Texas Jack Omohundro, and also James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. Scouts was the template from which Cody developed his fantastically popular Wild West show. No one could have known, wrote William H. and William N. Getzman, that the Scouts of the Prairie was a performance that would change American entertainment forever. It was the first Western. Judson's and Cody's stage partnership ended in June 1873, when after their last appearance together in upstate New York, Omohundro and Cody decided they could manage the show on their own. Omohundro and Cody realized that Judson's character was replaceable, while their personal appearances were not. Cody and Judson eventually repaired their awkward relationship and remained friends until Judson passed away in 1886. The explosive popularity of the true Buffalo Bill could not be surpassed, and never would be again. Judson's discovery of Cody and his immediate exploitation of him created a Western hero unparalleled in his era. Neither Judson nor his publisher, Street and Smith's New York Weekly, could have appreciated the magnitude of what they were creating, nor how enduring the legend of Buffalo Bill would become. In fact, Judson wrote only 5 novelettes featuring Buffalo Bill. Other authors, including Prentice Ingraham, W. Burt Foster, William Wallace Cook and the Reverend John Harvey Whitson picked up the mantle in the 1870s and wrote hundreds more throughout the following decades. John Burke and others took over Cody's performance career, but Judson will forever retain credit for discovering the American legend of Buffalo Bill. When Judson's experiment with Cody and live entertainment foundered in the fall of 1874, he retreated to his beloved mansion in Stamford, New York, a tiny hamlet nestled in the Catskill Mountains. He was not upset about his situation, because it was merely the latest in scores of adventures, and it gave him ideas for many more. By this time, he was earning between $10,000 and $20,000 a year from the hundreds of adventure stories he had written before he had ever met Cody and Hickok and the rest. This amount would place him squarely within millionaire status today. In truth, Judson had far more pressing issues. His wife of 2 years, Anna Fuller, desperately wished to start a family. He owed money to the attorney who had helped bail him out of a St. Louis jail in January 1874, when he arrived there with his troop and was immediately arrested for skipping out on court 20 years prior on the St. Louis riot charge. He was wanted in Maine for an 1873 incident when he had a Scouts troop member in charge of ammunitions arrested for stealing guns. Now this man successfully sued him for false complaint in absentia and won a $1,000 verdict. More stressful for Judson was the fact that an odd woman kept coming around the village and asking people about him and his wife and his home. Her name was Lovench Kelsey Swart, and she claimed to have been married to Edward in 1853, and again in 1863. This woman, 45, asked strangers whether the Judsons had any children, and when they had wed, and how old Anna was, and, according to Anna, any number of other deep and designing questions meant to cast aspersion on the writer and his much younger bride. But Lovench Swart was not trying to defame Judson or his bride. It would be difficult to do so, as the writer had been a notorious womanizer since he was a teen. Some of his marriages were bigamous, and Judson at times agreed to them merely to keep one step ahead of an angry father who might believe his daughter had been seduced. And in the mid to late 19th century, some newspapers were often too polite or too embarrassed to report what we would today call rape. Some of Judson's wives, including a few he had children with, were girls as young as 15, and some had been servants in his household. Judson's marriages and sexual proclivities were viewed negatively, but it is important to put his liaisons into context. To be sure, most of them were opportunistic, ill-conceived, and criminal, but it should be noted that two of Judson's driving forces throughout his whole life were the ideas of reinvention and legitimacy, which were sometimes at direct odds with each other. Marriage was a primary way for him to achieve both. He moved from city to town to hamlet, east to west, urban to rural, and back again, chasing adventure and income. He met many different kinds of women, and in his own corrupted or contorted way, thought a marriage ceremony would bring validity to his liaisons, both for him and his partners. And though he truly found his intellectual match with at least two of these wives, the others should not be relegated to a much lower status. He had a genuine affection for their exoticism, energy, ability to be a good helpmeet, or some combination of all of these things. As for Lovench, she was merely trying to get the financial support she so badly needed from the man who married her at least twice, and who had made her a number of promises over the previous 22 years. Lovench knew him better than any other woman Judson had married, and there were at least 9 others. He had confided in her about his oppressive father, and how Levi Judson's raging morality pushed Edward to join the Navy as a youth, and she knew about at least some of Edward's illegitimate children. Evidence shows he had at least 4, besides the 5 to whom he gave his last name. Swart knew about Judson's gifts, too. After all, they were the reasons she had been drawn to him in 1851 after her husband died. He could be protective and paternal. He promised he would take care of her and be a father to her toddler son, Frank. He was humorous, solicitous, charming, well-groomed, and generous. Swart was a novice writer herself and enjoyed literary pursuits.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?